So in the last episode then we saw how the new covenant had to be confirmed. The new covenant had to be confirmed in the same way as the old covenant was confirmed by Moses. The confirmation of the old covenant at Sinai by Moses was a type, and the antitype is the confirmation of the new covenant, and we know that Jesus confirmed the new covenant on the cross. We're going to look at that later, but we will show some proofs that Jesus did confirm the new covenant on the cross. So all the ceremonies that Moses carried out, those 10 ceremonies, in order to confirm the old covenant at Sinai, Jesus had to fulfill just before and on the cross. And so when Moses sprinkled blood and water above the law of the old covenant, that means that on the cross, when Jesus was confirming the new covenant, he had to sprinkle his blood and water above the law of the new covenant. And so when Christ sprinkled his blood and water above the law of the 10 Commandments, he was fulfilling a certain ceremony that Moses had already carried out. What ceremony was carried out in the old covenant, which the blood and water of Christ on the mercy seat fulfilled? When Moses confirmed the old covenant, he sprinkled blood and water above the book of the law, and this was a type of what Christ was to do. So when Christ confirmed the new covenant, which he did on the cross, he too had to sprinkle his blood and water above the tables of the law, just as Ron Wyatt found. Now the fact is that Jesus did fulfill this ceremony at the cross. If we do not believe in this discovery, then how was the sprinkling of the law by Moses in Hebrews 9:19 fulfilled? Can it be biblical that Jesus fulfilled all the other things that Moses did, but not this one? So this discovery fulfills Hebrews 9:19. There is no other ceremony or event that could fulfill Hebrews 9:19. So if this discovery isn't true, it means basically that God forgot to fulfill Hebrews 9:19, which we know is not possible. We'll look later at other ceremonies which could possibly be considered to have fulfilled Hebrews 9:19, but we're going to see that none of them could have been. So when people study this, sometimes people say that Hebrews 9:19 was fulfilled after Jesus ascended to heaven, for example, upon the heavenly Ark of the Covenant. But we're going to take a look at those things and see if that could possibly be true or not. Now, just to put things into context, when I'm talking about confirming a covenant, some other examples of confirming a covenant would be a wedding ceremony or a baptismal ceremony. So in a baptism, the Christian is confirming a covenant with God. And so there's certain ceremonies that take place there. At a wedding, there's the bride and the groom, and they're confirming a covenant between themselves and God. And there's certain ceremonies that take place there. The vows are read out, and they're verbally agreed to, and they're written down, and they're signed and sealed, and the rings are exchanged, etc. So in the same way, the old covenant, the salvational covenant between God and the nation of Israel, there were 10 ceremonies that were carried out in order to confirm that covenant. And equally under the new covenant, there were 10 ceremonies which were carried out to confirm the new covenant. And one of those ceremonies was that the law had to be confirmed as part of the new covenant. And that happened when Jesus sprinkled his blood and water above the tables of the law. That was a parallel to the married couple signing the vows, if you like. So the vows are the law of marriage, and the married couple has to sign those vows, or sign the certificate. And in the same way, Jesus signed the tables of stone with his blood. And we know it's Jesus' signature because of the chromosome count. But we're going to go into all that a little bit later on. So, if this discovery wasn't true, it means that God forgot to fulfill Hebrews 9:19. That's how we know this discovery has to be true, which is why the proof text for this discovery is Hebrews 9:19. But Hebrews 9:19 not only contains the proof that this discovery is true, but also the message or the testimony of this discovery. Do you remember one Bible commentary 1109 said that the tables of stone would be giving a testimony to the world of the counterfeit Sabbath? So once you understand the message behind Hebrews 9:19 and what Moses was trying to tell the people in sprinkling the blood and water above the book of the law, then we'll understand what Jesus is trying to tell the people when he sprinkled his blood and water above the tables of the law. Basically, Jesus was confirming that these tables of the law are part of the new covenant. We'll look into that in much greater depth later on. Now, as soon as people understand this study, some of the questions arise, and I found that one of the first questions, when I say there's no other antitype to Hebrews 9:19, and that God must have forgotten to fulfill Hebrews 9:19 if this discovery is not true, the first question that seems to arise is, well, Hebrews 9:19 doesn't have to have a fulfillment. It is a type, it's a shadow, but it doesn't have to have an antitype. So people say, you say Christ had to fulfill Hebrews 9:19, but why did he? And then they say, not all the types had to be fulfilled. So I'd like to show that that's not entirely true. Christ came to fulfill the law and the prophets, or he came to fulfill the Torah and the prophets. If he did not do this, he was not the Messiah, as all the types and shadows pointed to the Messiah. So just because the antitype to Hebrews 9:19 is not clearly spelled out in the Bible, it doesn't mean it isn't there, or it doesn't mean that there isn't an antitype. The antitype to the inauguration of the high priest isn't mentioned either, but we know it happened because the type exists. So where there's a type, there has to be an antitype. So it's biblical to look at a type and see that the antitype must therefore exist, even though it's not spelled out in the Bible. I'm going to suggest something rather loosely now without defending it too much, but just for the record really. 1844 and Jesus moving to the most holy place isn't clearly spelled out in the Bible, in my opinion. The Millerites had so much trouble finding the antitype or finding the answer to Daniel 8:13 and 14, because it doesn't anywhere clearly say that Jesus in 1844 moves to the most holy place. The only reason that the Millerites eventually decided that Jesus had moved to the most holy place in 1844 is because it exists in type. They looked at the typical service of the Day of Atonement and they said, well, that must have happened in heaven. So it's really the same as this discovery, even though the Bible doesn't just clearly and plainly say in a surface text that Jesus sprinkled his blood and water above the tables of the law on the cross. We know it must have happened because we know it happened in type in Hebrews 9:19. Anyway, the point of this episode is to prove that all the types and all the shadows did have to find their fulfillment in Jesus. In other words, Jesus did have to fulfill Hebrews 9:19. You can't say that God just didn't need to fulfill it, or it doesn't have an antitype. So I'm going to quickly read through about 4 or 5 Ellen White quotes which say just that. She says, do you see Christ as the antitype of all the types, the precious, glorious substance of all the shadows, the full signification of all the symbols? The types and shadows were instituted by Christ himself to transmit to man an idea of the plan devised for his redemption. So this quote and several others like it say that if Christ did not fulfill Hebrews 9:19, he was not the Messiah. So we cannot contest that Hebrews 9:19 doesn't have an antitype. It doesn't need to be fulfilled. Our Saviour in his life and death fulfilled all the prophecies pointing to himself and was the substance of all the types and shadows signified. And that would have to include the type and shadow of Hebrews 9:19, because it says all the types and shadows, just as this previous quote here says all the types, all the shadows, and the signification of all the symbols. While Moses was in the mount, God presented to him not only the tables of the law, but also the plan of salvation. He saw the sacrifice of Christ prefigured all the types and symbols of the Jewish age. So there she's saying that on the cross, Jesus prefigured all the types and symbols, and that would have to include Hebrews 9:19 again, because it says all the types and symbols, and Hebrews 9:19 was a type and a symbol. Christ also fulfilled the antitype to Moses being the mediator. So by the way, it says Moses was a type of Christ in Patriarchs and Prophets. So if you remember, as we went down the list of the 10 ceremonies that were carried out at Sinai in Exodus 24, verses 3 to 8, Moses was carrying out those ceremonies, and he was a type of Christ. And Ellen White says it right there. Moses was a type of Christ. So everything that Moses did, Jesus had to do when he was confirming the new covenant on the cross. Deuteronomy 18 says very much the same thing. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. So what would we say if a Messiah came and didn't fulfill all the types and shadows? He would be a false Messiah. So those people that say Jesus came but didn't have to fulfill Hebrews 9:19, I'm suggesting that if he didn't fulfill Hebrews 9:19, he would be a false Christ. Christ had to fulfill Hebrews 9:19, and in order to do so, he had to sprinkle his blood and water above the law of the new covenant. And that's what Ellen White says. Now the time had come when all the types and symbols pointing to Christ's suffering and death were to be fulfilled. So notice she's talking about the suffering and death, or in other words, on the cross. All of the types and symbols were to be fulfilled on the cross. And then she says, shall he fail and come short in his work of redemption? So if he didn't fulfill all the types and symbols on the cross, he would fail as the Messiah. So we see then biblically it's not an option to say Hebrews 9:19 doesn't have an antitype, or it doesn't have a fulfillment. So we're going to look at some other ceremonies and see if they could have possibly fulfilled Hebrews 9:19.